We're here again with Mark Collinsworth of Vere Global, an expert on finance, international and domestic. And Mark, I know that you've been monitoring Biden's performance at the G7. He just left Geneva hours ago after what is being touted by him, his administration, and some of the networks, the MSNBC, CNN, those who usually boost Biden. They're all calling it a success in terms on many fronts, but we're more concerned now about the economy. What's going to happen? Was there any more leverage that Biden has coming out of the G7 and his meeting with Putin in terms of restoring the U.S. economy? What do you think?
Thanks, Larry. I'm going to say no at this point, and the reason why is that whenever a president tries to cut deals with a foreign country, those are classified as treaties, and treaties actually are going to require a 60 member vote in the Senate. And right now, with it being split 50-50 Republicans and Democrats, I don't think you're going to be able to get the 60 votes to override a filibuster to approve any economic agenda that he has agreed to with the European nations.
Well, he seems to be saying more generally, treaty or not, Congress or not, that America has restored its place at the table, and we are now becoming much more friendly again with our traditional allies in Western Europe, and he's portraying that as a big gain for the U.S., unlike what was going on with Trump, where he was alienating our traditional allies. So, treaties or not, the fact that he and the G7 nations are warming up to each other again, is that a plus in any real sense?
I'm going to take that as a negative, because one of the reasons why Donald Trump was elected in the first place was because people just didn't like how things were going in the direction of the United States. That happens to go with, how jobs are getting sent overseas, how, European countries with their steel, cheaper steel products, China and stuff. So I don't see that really as a plus. And what kind of irritated me about the meeting he had with, I think, the French president, he told Biden, welcome to the club. And I was reading on one of the news articles, if you're president of the United States, you shouldn't be a member of the club. Your job is to look out for the country as a whole, not be in a good old boys club where you cut deals behind closed doors and you pat yourself on the back and go to extravagant parties. I don't think a president should ever be really buddy-buddy with a foreign country. It should be business, and that should be it.
Well, Fox, of course, is always on Biden's case, has been analyzing it negatively, saying it and pointing out quite prominently that Biden's approval of the pipeline that Russia is going to be channeling with their gas through and oil through Europe, while he's shutting down the pipeline in the U.S. from Canada, they're saying that makes no sense in terms of helping the U.S. economy. What's your reading on that?
They're exactly correct. That is not going to help the United States one bit. It's actually going to help Russia more. Russia actually has the largest natural gas company in the world, is actually located in Russia, that actually gives a lot of natural gas. It's called Gazprom, is the name of the company.
Right.
So by us not drilling and using our oil and our gas reserves here, you basically have now given Russia a very strong strategic position in Europe, because if a war ever did break out in Europe between Russia and NATO, or any kind of misgivings, Russia can simply cut off that gas supply, and now you've got an entire nation that has no energy to it. So I think the Biden administration is very wrong on this. You don't need to rely on other countries for assets like oil. If you have the assets in your country, you need to be using those, not relying on your enemy.
Well, supposedly Biden approved that pipeline largely with pressure or with the pleadings of Angela Merkel, because Germany needed that source of gas and oil. Now, did they need it, or could they have gotten enough from the U.S.? Was she really in a tight spot, and that's why Biden gave in?
I think so. Germany as a whole has kind of got problems. So, yeah, I think he gave in on that. But, also kind of adding on, just thinking, there was actually a judge in Texas that actually said that Biden's ruling or executive order on disbanding the pipeline was actually illegal, and is actually basically barring Biden from issuing that executive order, if that kind of makes sense, for oil drilling.
Well, I mean, how much of a different situation would be if the Canadian pipeline was allowed by Biden, not shut down, and if he did not approve the Russian pipeline into Europe? I mean, would that really change the balance of energy and power that much and the economy?
I believe it would. You know, when Trump was in office, I think oil was trading somewhere around 30 something dollars a barrel, upper 30s. And then once Biden came in and actually shut down that pipeline, we've now seen oil go up into the high 60s, low 70s. We've seen gasoline prices skyrocket. So again, there's a huge cost to bring oil from overseas, transportation cost to bring it here to the United States. If you drill it in your own backyard, there's hardly any transportation cost to it. And you're also creating jobs for Americans, not creating jobs for people in foreign lands.
Well, I mean, could the U.S. have been supplying Europe sufficiently, or did they need that extra supply from Russia with that Russian pipeline?
They could get everything they need from the United States, but for some strange reason they want to go with the Russians. A lot of people don't realize this, Larry, but the United States actually has more oil reserves in it than Saudi Arabia has in it. The only real difference between the two is the oil in Saudi Arabia is closer to the surface, so it's much cheaper to drill it, whereas in the United States it's much deeper and there's a little bit more cost to actually drill that deep.
Well, what was the situation with Europe getting its supply of oil and gas? Did they need the U.S. supply, or where were they getting it, and what did they really need that Russian pipeline?
Well, again, it comes down to NATO. You really don't want to be relying on an enemy of your country to be supplying, oil and stuff to it. So I think for Europe, they should be using the United States more. They need to be using the Norway oil reserves more. They don't need to be relying on Russia whatsoever.
Yeah, well, and Fox made the point that which I think is valid, that he gave it away for nothing in return from Putin. It wasn't like he told Putin that if we approve that pipeline, you have to give something, just a giveaway. Is that your analysis of it too?
That'd be my analysis. I think to sum up everything on the president, I think we have a very weak president that does not stand up for America.
There's also talk about a 15% global tax. How would that work?
The 15% tax?
Yeah.
Yes. So how it works right now is that let's say you're Apple computers and you sell $100 million of Apple products in France. Well, Apple has an offshore bank in Ireland, so that $100 million that they sell in France, they transfer it to the offshore bank in Ireland, and Ireland has a very, very low tax rate on that. So they avoid paying U.S. taxes and avoid paying taxes to the French government. What they're proposing on that is if they sell $100 million worth of profits or make $100 million worth of profits in France, France will have the right to tax 15% of that $100 million, so that the country that originates in is the country that gets paid the taxes on it.
So would that help us or hurt us?
I think it'll actually end up hurting us, because these corporations, capitalism is all about making money. And I think a lot of these companies like Apple will just find other ways to get around it. To give you a case in point, sure, if your G7 countries sign on for this tax, well, great. But what happens to these countries that aren't members of G7? I can see Apple opening up offshore bank accounts in South Africa, Nigeria, Singapore, all these countries that aren't part of the G7 or European nations, and funneling money through those.
So you're saying overall, Biden's trip, here he is getting off the plane behind me, and when he returned today, it was supposedly in triumph from Geneva. So, but you're saying that we really didn't gain much from the G7 conference and his face-to-face with Putin. So he's coming back, you're thinking, pretty empty-handed in terms of strengthening or even maintaining the U.S. economy.
Correct, because the presidents are really, without the support of the House of Representatives and the Senate, a president really is nothing more than a figurehead that just simply makes statements. He's very limited in what he can do on foreign policy with other countries. Again, everything that deals with a foreign country is classified as a treaty. So if you sign a bill, you have to get 60 members in the Senate to agree to that. And right now, there's no way he's going to get 60 members. Like that 15% tax, that will require a 60-man vote in the Senate, and he's just not going to get that there.
So what should be done to strengthen the U.S. economy? And what could Biden do? What could others do? What has to happen to make sure that the economy here is solid and increasingly beneficial to a broad demographic?
Well, I've got two answers for that. The first answer, longer term, I think the United States has got itself in a huge problem that they really can't get themselves out of. And it's been basically 50 years in the making to get here. And so if you really try to fix the 50-year problem, it's not something you're going to fix in 1, 2, or 3 years. It's really a decade-long project, and they've just gotten themselves in too deep on that.
And what was the 50-year problem that grew here?
It's been a combination of very loose monetary policy. It's been a policy of using recession stimulating tactics like cutting taxes outside of recession. That's not something that you want to do. You want to keep that for recession. And all of that has led to a massive expansion of debt and welfare programs. To give you an example, right now, Social Security, Medicare, and welfare plans, along with the interest on our debt, those 4 items are called mandatory payments under the U.S. government. They have to be made no matter what. Those 4 items get paid before anything else in the government gets paid for. Those 4 items make up 70% of all the tax revenue that comes into the government. So for every $1 that comes into the government from taxes, 70 cents of it goes out to pay Social Security, Medicare, and interest on our debt.
Should those programs be cut?
Those programs need to just be done away with, because right now you're paying 70% of your tax revenue is going into those projects. So the government basically has to go out and borrow another $1 trillion every year to keep the U.S. government to make payroll, to pay defense spending, all that kind of stuff. If you actually map it out, as more baby boomers start tapping into Social Security and tapping into Medicare and things like that, if you do the math on it, in 10 years from now, it won't be for every $1 of tax revenue comes in, 70 cents go out. It's going to be for every $1 that comes into the government, it's going to be $1.40 going out just to cover those 4 items.
But Mike, I could hear a lot of our listeners now howling out there that, what do you mean do away with Social Security and Medicare? I mean, where would the working class, even the middle class, be if those programs are not just even eliminated, but even reduced? I mean, what's going to happen to people who've worked hard all their lives, and then no Social Security, no Medicare?
Well, eventually those programs are going to collapse on their very own in probably, the next, 15, 20 or 30 years. Where the real problem has come at with Social Security is when Social Security was originally set up, it was actually designed so that the individual, like you, Larry, you would actually have an account with your name on it, and that money would go. So if you put $10,000 in, it would go into an account with your name on it, and the government would make a small match to that. But over the years, what's happened is now Social Security gets paid out to people that may have never even contributed to it. Give you an example. One of my friends, his wife died about 3 or 4 years ago, and the kids who have never worked before now are collecting 2 Social Security checks each, and they will continue collecting Social Security checks until they reach the age of 18. That's another 10 years off that they're going to collect two Social Security checks for the next 10 years, and they never contributed to the system to get that money. That's how much waste has been done on this program.
All right, Mark, no matter the depth of the mess we're in now, what do you do? What's the alternative? And how are you going to explain this to working class, middle class people who've worked hard all their lives, and now you're saying that should be taken away? Well, what would be the alternative? What would help them out in the alternative?
Well, the alternative thing to
what in other words, what would you replace it with?
Well, the actual original Social Security system that was designed was perfect. There was no reason to go right now. The Social Security, it's nothing but a bunch of IOUs. All the money that goes into Social Security, the money that you contribute, it basically gets put into T-bonds, and the United States government pays you 1% on it, and it's just nothing but IOUs. To fix the problem, you have to go back to the way it was originally set up. Don't pay out people that never contributed to it. Don't use it as don't use it to borrow money for U.S. debt to finance your projects. Take it like it was originally designed. If you put $10,000 of your money into Social Security, then you should have $10,000 guaranteed to you. That's your money. Your $10,000 doesn't get split between other people. When Social Security was originally put together, there for every one person pulling Social Security out, there was 5 people contributing to it. Today, there's 5 people pulling out of it for every one person contributing to it. It's totally reversed.
Okay, but what I'm asking is, now that it is in such a mess as you describe it, what do you can you reform it at this point and retain it? Or are you saying throw it out and come up with something else, or don't have any support for the working and middle class people?
Well, you kind of hit the nail on the head. Any politician that runs on a platform of trying to revamp Social Security, they're going to talk about how you're taking away stuff, cutting benefits, and all that kind of stuff. No one's going to run on that kind of platform, and that's where the real problem comes at. You need to get Social Security back to how it was originally designed. You need to just stop using it as an ATM machine to pay for this project and that project, because at some point, if you keep on writing checks out of an account that you don't have money in, it's eventually going to go bankrupt anyway. So why not make the decisions now? And I'm not talking about cutting the people that contributed to it. Those people contributed to the programs. They should get the money. But people that never worked, like those kids I just explained to you, they should never be collecting Social Security that they never contributed to.
All right, so you're saying that the way you could maintain Social Security and take care of those who deserve it is to cut out the people who do not deserve it, never contributed. Now, can that really be done practically at this point?
Unfortunately, it cannot be done because it all comes down to politics, and politicians' sole job is to make enough people like you that they will reelect you. And making cuts to Social Security will put you in the unpopular camp.
So what you're saying is, because politically it can't be done because of the way politicians are, they depend on these votes, these constituencies. So since it can't be done politically, you're saying that we're headed for its dissolution anyway. It's going to go broke anyway, is what you're saying.
Correct. Now, there are ways, and this gets back to more of the short-term question you asked, is how can you make Social Security last longer? I think you make it last longer is you get more people employed. So like right now, I read a report 2 days ago that there's actually employees asking their bosses to fire them. Why would you ask your boss to fire you? Because if you get fired and you start collecting unemployment benefits, you will make more on unemployment benefits than you will from actually working. So people are making $400 a week. If they get fired, they can collect $400 in unemployment, actually even better, because part of the unemployment benefits are tax-free to you. You'll actually make more money by getting fired from your job. And that's a huge problem. That's money being paid out that no Social Security taxes are being collected on.
Of course, you can't blame people for that, right? I mean, why work and make less? Yeah.
Correct.
So, I mean, do you expect that to continue, or will they curtail it now that we are supposedly coming out of the pandemic and the lockdown?
Well, I think it's going to be curtailed because you're going to have, we have an election coming up. Midterm elections are coming up next year, and by the time fall rolls around, you're going to have all these people on the other side of the table talking about how one party gave away all this stuff, it's hurting the economy, it's causing inflation, and those people on the other side. One thing that's so amazing about midterm elections or elections in general is people that talk outside of the election zone that are far left, and people that talk that are on the right that talk on stuff about far right. The closer and closer you get to election, the more and more both sides tend to come to the center on their policies and viewpoints.
Well, another factor here is you say more people should go back to work. So let's say you reform that, you stop paying people for not working. You do all that, but considering the China factor, where all the jobs have been outsourced, and that's going to continue because the politicians depend on satisfying the corporations that do that because they're the ones who support them and make campaign contributions. So, even if you cut out the unemployment benefits for not working and you get people back to work, but the jobs themselves are diminishing because of the China factor, correct?
Correct. And that brings us to another problem. This goes to the 50-year problem that we had. This problem actually goes back closer to 100 years. So to kind of give you a breakdown on the answer here, when you go and buy, let's say you buy a widget here in the United States and you pay $10 for it, that $10 really isn't going towards profits to the company. That part of that $10 is going to pay Social Security tax, Medicare tax, regulations, fringe benefits like healthcare programs, 401k plans. So that $10, really what you're paying is about $7 of that is going to pay to cover all the expenses that business has to cover because of government intervening in people's business. They shouldn't be intervening. The China side, they don't have 401k plans. So you don't have to, when you buy the $3 widget from them, you're not paying for the 401k plan. You're not paying for Social Security. You're not paying for Medicare taxes. You're not paying for all those things or fringe benefits. That's why things are so much cheaper made in China. Oh. And then to add to that, China devalues its currency, so it makes it even cheaper on top of that.
All right, Mark. So I understand that naturally you can't compete with China in terms of the cost of labor because of the benefits here and the regulations here. But, would you do away with that here and have people work for the kind of wages and lack of any kind of benefits and protection that the Chinese workers are forced to work under? Is that the solution, to have Americans work like Chinese are?
Well, take off some of the regulations. Like right now, like I know that depending on where you live at, you're going to have the regulations that the county has passed for businesses. Then you're going to have state regulations that the state government has put on those businesses. Then you're going to have federal regulations put on top of that. So you're reporting to 3 different agencies that regulate you. Not to mention, depending on your business, you may even have to report to 4 or 5 others. China doesn't have that. And that's one of the things that Trump was doing, is he was deregulating a lot of these excess regulations that we had on it. Why do you need to have 4 different agencies that have 4 different set of rules to accomplish the exact same thing? Get rid of 3 agencies and use 1 agency to regulate all the stuff.
So are you saying that you can get rid of excess regulations and you would still have workers being well paid and cared for under the U.S. economic system? Or would it get back to predatory capitalism and the robber baron era when, the working class was impoverished until they became active through the unions and even some radical social programs, which forced the companies to be more reasonable? Are you saying that you eliminate these regulations and it's not going to turn into that kind of a situation again, where the workers were deeply and unfairly and plainly exploited?
Correct. I can give you an example. Like if you have state regulations and federal regulations, you're going to have to hire an attorney for compliance reasons, depending on your industry, that's going to handle the federal regulations, and another lawyer to handle the state regulations. If you just had, let's say, the federal cover or just a state, you could eliminate that one attorney's job altogether, and now you're only paying 1 compliance person versus 2. That excess savings now can go to hire another person, or the excess savings can go to invest into technology to actually make better products.
And why are you so confident that that's what would happen, that they would invest in better products that would turn into more jobs and better wages, rather than just grabbing all they can, such as they did with the tax cuts, the last round of tax cuts? Really, what they did was just buy back their own stock, and it didn't turn it into jobs. So, what makes you so confident that they just won't take advantage of these cuts, and that'll snowball, and the workers will be left holding a diminished bag of wages?
Well, I didn't say all the profits would go towards increasing technology, but a good portion of it will, because as you increase technology, you'll increase profits by cutting, costs and stuff. So yes, you are correct that a portion of those savings would go into stock buyback programs, but a portion to stay competitive, because that's what capitalism really is being more competitive than your neighbor. So a portion of it would go into technology and improving workers' education for that.
Yeah, but don't forget, Mark. I mean, theoretically, it's supposed to work that way, but unbridled, unregulated capitalism, when we had that going on in the United States, you didn't have a prosperous working and middle class. what you had was predatory, monopolistic companies and heads of industry that were making all the money, and it wasn't coming down to the workers. And it took radical action by the workers and unionism to get a fair shake. Now, maybe some of that is excessive today, but again, what I'm saying is, isn't there a danger that if you start deregulating like this, it's going to revert back to the way it was when the workers really were being exploited? The kids in sweatshops, people in coal mines in Scranton, no safety regulations. What makes you sure that it wouldn't just regress back to that?
I'm going to rely back on the basics of capitalism here. I think the reason why you saw all those things like, the sweatshops back in the early 1900s, things like that, is because you had excess workers. There were so many workers out there, you could basically say, I'm going to pay you pennies on the dollar to come work for me. But over the course of the time, as the economy grows and gets more prosperous, you're now going to have to start competing for a higher quality employee. You won't be able to just take anybody. You'll need people that are more specialized. You'll need people that are hard working. And by the very necessity, you'll have to increase wages. And by nature, you'll have to increase the fringe benefits. Eventually, all these things that the United States has, 401k plans, healthcare, eventually, when enough workers are working in China, China will be forced to go down that exact same pathway and start providing fringe benefits and healthcare and stuff. The difference between when China starts doing it and today is I think China's going to learn from all the mistakes that the United States has made in that program, and they're going to improve upon it, if that kind of makes sense.
Well, but the counter argument of that is that China is not a democracy. It's a communist state. The government controls everything. And, if they don't want the workers to prosper, but they want China to advance as a whole, as a nation, and become dominant, it's not going to work that way. And also, getting back to the U.S., what you just said, it depends upon a demographic model where the birth rate keeps going down and there are fewer and fewer workers. Will that necessarily be the case? And if that is the case, is that good for the nation? Would us not replace ourselves? And then you bring in foreign workers, which is what's going on now at the border, where they're bringing in cheap labor. That's part of the reason why I think the border is remaining open like that. So again, would that model work where there would be fewer workers, American workers, and therefore wages would have to be raised and conditions would have to improve, or are they just going to bring in more foreign cheap labor?
Well, right now, the way the government has basically, again, mismanaged itself for the last 50 years, they've designed it to where it's actually more prosperous for a U.S. company to hire an illegal immigrant to come in and work than it is for an actual American worker.
Right.
And until you basically, and this goes back to, shutting down the border, building a wall or whatever, because you can't compete with somebody that is a U.S. citizen that wants to be paid, $20 an hour, get all these fringe benefits to someone that comes over here illegally. You can pay them under the table, not pay the Social Security, the Medicare taxes, not have to pay income taxes and such. The government has just designed itself. It's just better to hire illegal immigrants. And that goes back to fixing the 50-year problem. You need to stop illegal immigrants coming into the country and benefiting from Social Security that they never contributed to, benefiting from healthcare programs that they've never contributed to or paid taxes on.
But with the corporations holding such sway over the government and the corporations wanting that cheap labor, realistically, what are the chances of reversing that?
Realistically, slim to none, because the people that write the laws are politicians, and the corporations are the biggest funders of politicians. Now, you're a politician, you go and talk to a billionaire or a multi-millionaire, automatically he can write you out a check for $10-15 million and not even blink. That goes a long ways in politics, and to keep that money flowing, you need to cut some deals and stuff. It kind of always amazes me, Larry, if you're a politician, the first year you get elected, let's say you're worth $100,000. If you stay in office 6 or 7 years, you start your net worth goes to 15 or $20 million on a $200,000 a year salary. I think somebody should really start asking a question how you became worth $15 million on a $200,000 a year salary.
All right, but Mark, all these fixes that you recommend that you say would work, all these loosening of regulations, et cetera, barring all this illegal immigration. Again, we've just agreed that it's not going to happen politically because it benefits the politicians and the corporations who sponsor that. So therefore, is not your conclusion that we're in deep doo-doo and it's just going to get worse and worse. It's not going to turn around.
Correct. In all reality, it really won't get any better. Essentially, it's kind of like, I kind of compare this to like, you have two kinds of parents. One parent wants to do the right thing for the children. They want to go to bed early. They want them to study. They want them to exercise, eat healthy food. That parent might not be the favorite parent amongst kids. The other parent gives them chocolate, lets them stay up late, and all that stuff just causes problems in the long term. That's what the political parties here have become. They've become the parent that gives away the chocolate, lets the kids stay up late, not do their homework. And you see that happening now in America. We have people with low educations, not healthy. Yeah, they make the argument to have a healthcare system because we've let people get so unhealthy that they need a healthcare system and they blame it on the government. So you are 100% correct. We've kind of passed the point of no return. It's not feasible to really fix. Politically, it's not feasible. And even if you did get enough politicians say, yeah, we have a plan to fix it, you're never going to get it fixed because they'll either get voted out or they just don't have enough time. When you create a 50-year problem, you can't fix it in a decade.
So are we doomed? I mean, we put our head in the sand and wait for the waves to come in and wipe us out. I mean, you're saying that there's no fix. You're saying there's no fix.
Well, the nature of the financial markets does kind of have a fix. If you look back through history, going all the way back to the Roman Empire, when you have excessive amounts of problems created in a government, when you allow things to just be given away and ignored, eventually they fix themselves. I'll give you a perfect example.
Well, the Roman Empire didn't fix itself. It fell apart. And we had the Dark Ages. So that didn't self-regulate and fix itself, self-correct itself. Why should we be any different?
Actually, it did fix itself. The collapse of the Roman Empire totally erased the problem.
Yeah. And, Europe did not emerge, modern Europe and any kind of civilization did not emerge for 600, 700, 800 years. So you had that long a period of the Dark Ages.
Correct. But on the Roman Empire, I'll give you a really good example. One of the reasons the Roman Empire collapsed was because in the Roman Empire, the Roman citizens got so, let's say, we'll call it stuck up. They didn't think they had to do any work anymore. So what they do, they basically, other countries or other immigrants came into their countries. They hired those people to be the babysitters, to do their yard work.
That sounds familiar. That sounds familiar, yeah.
And make things while they sat back and did nothing. What did that do? That basically, Romans the actual Romans had a very strong mindset on the empire building. But when you started having these immigrants come in and babysit your kids, those immigrants installed a culture into those kids that was opposite of the empire building mentality. And you see that in the United States today. You have people who are American citizens who hate the United States. And the reason they hate the United States is because another culture has come in here and it is starting to ingrain its ideology into those kids at a very, very early age.
So we are Rome and we are about to dissolve.
Eventually, I believe we will. Now, it took the Roman Empire hundreds and hundreds of years. So, I think the Roman Empire lasted, almost 1,000 years. So the United States has been around for 200 and something years. We still have a ways to go, but
we may not last as long as Rome lasted because things seem to be accelerating. But, before we get back to this doom and gloom scenario, let's examine why capitalism did work. The economic system did work in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and part of the 70s before we started running into these problems. And it built a prosperous working and middle class. Why did it work then? And why is it working now? And what made it fall apart? What was the sequence of events there? We covered a lot of this, but when you examine it, it was working. Coming out of the Second World War, the working class in the 40s, 50s, and most of the 60s was prosperous. And the middle class, then it started going down. So let's examine the sequence of that and how that happened.
I think a lot of it, you can actually trace a lot of this back to the Industrial Revolution of the United States. As you saw, like you talked about the robber barons. As the industrial power increased, something happened to the political sphere that had never seen before. To become a politician, you needed unlimited amounts of financing. The only people that had that financing was the people that ran the industries. And so when you go to those people and you say, hey, I need money, that person's naturally going to say, what are you going to do for me? And once they get elected, they change the laws or put regulations in place that actually benefits that original company, or they give tax cuts to finish it. So you basically saw these industries get bigger and bigger and bigger with more and more money. And that eventually led to our entire political system is based on cash flows of cash flows going into the political machine. And those decisions now hurt the individual worker. So give you an example. The politicians always talk about, the billionaires don't pay taxes. Jeff Bezos doesn't pay taxes. Mark Zuckerberg doesn't pay taxes. Well, here's the real rub. They're not doing anything illegal. They're simply abiding by the tax laws put in place, and the politicians are the ones that wrote those tax laws. So how can a politician talk bad about Jeff Bezos when they're actually the person that caused the problems to begin with?
Yeah, Trump used to allude to that quite a bit. He says, well, that's the laws allow that. He didn't write the laws, and he didn't even blame foreign nations like China and all that. He says, they're taking advantage of the laws we wrote that allows that to happen. So, it's our own. These were monsters of our own creation, China and all the other competition. And again, these tax laws are written by people with ties to big money and big powerful interests, corporations and individuals. So again, we created this mess. But again, we're getting. We should talk more about. You were mentioning before off camera here about Zuckerberg. Some of the tricks he uses to pay no taxes because of the way the laws allow that.
Yeah. So Mark Zuckerberg, he's worth what? About $50 billion. So he makes about 200. I think his actual salary, he makes about a $200,000 a year salary working at Facebook. But here's what he does. He can use that $50 billion as collateral to get a bank loan. So let's say he gets a $100 million bank loan from the bank. He can use that $100 million to go out and buy himself a $10 million mansion, a $30 million yacht, use it to have a grand old time. That $100 million that he borrows from the bank, that's not income. So he pays no income taxes on that.
Wow.
And here's the real rub. The interest he pays on that $100 million, he might pay what? $2-3 million in interest on that money. Well, guess what? That's a loan that's tax deductible. So that $200,000 salary he gets a 100% refund back on that because he took a $2 million loss on paying the bank loan back.
Unbelievable. And now if you do well in the stock market, there's a lot of people now in the middle class that they don't make real big fortunes, but they get some benefit from stocks that do well for them. But once they draw from that and sell it, it's the capital gains tax, unlike a bank loan. All right, that's a big difference.
Correct. And that's one of the things several politicians want to do. If you're worth $50 billion and you're $50 billion, like let's say Warren Buffett, the 97% of Warren Buffett's wealth is tied up in Berkshire Hathaway stock. Yeah. There's politicians, and he hasn't sold it. He's given a lot of it away to charity, but there's politicians that want to say, hey, you've got $50 billion in stock. We want to tax that $50 billion now and get money off of it, even if you haven't sold it. And I don't know how that's going to work, because if it goes up or goes down, it's a loss. But the issue I really have with that is politicians say, let's, and even people, your working class people say, hey, yeah, we should tax that $50 billion. Well, let's bring it to their equivalent. The working class people has 401k plans and IRAs. If you tax Warren Buffett's $50 billion of stock he hasn't sold, that's the equivalent of saying, let's tax the money, the Apple stock you have in your IRAs and your 401k plans before you pull the money out. And people don't see it. The equality of the law has totally been abandoned.
Yeah, and you also talk about what you say is the hypocrisy of Elizabeth Warren and the way she's going after taxing the rich people.
Right. Elizabeth Warren sits back and she lives in what, a $2 million home or something, but yet complains about, how the rich people take advantage of the poor people. But she's one of the very same people that wrote the laws that help the rich people get rich. And what really irritates me is when she was on the campaign trail to run for the presidential nominee for the Democrat Party. Do you know who she was going to raise money? She wasn't going to the working class people. She was going to the Mark Zuckerbergs and the Jeff Bezos to get money, because one visit to them can land you $10 million, where you can talk to 10,000 working class people and barely raise $1,000.
So nothing changes in the political game. It's different terminology. The faces change, the players change, but the mechanisms that drive this, where the rich get richer, the money brings you power, and that the money is tied into politicians that feed off of it through campaign contribution, who knows what else. So isn't that also some of the eternal immutable laws of capitalism, and nothing is going to change? Essentially.
You're right. Nothing's going to change. And that brings me to another point I want to throw out here. Let's tackle Obamacare. You want to know what really irritates me with Obamacare is that when they wrote the laws for Obamacare, they called in the CEOs of the 5 largest healthcare companies in the world to consult them on writing the laws. You're going to pass a healthcare law that's going to hurt the healthcare industry, and you're going to ask the very same people to help you write the laws to hurt the industry. They didn't do that. Those CEOs, why do you think healthcare stocks have all gone through the roof in the last 10 years? Because those CEOs told the politicians, you should write the law this way, and writing the law that way put a hell of a lot more money in the United Healthcare's pocket and Progressive's pocket than it would if someone had used common sense to write a healthcare law.
All right, Mark, before we wrap it up, I'm going to ask you the question I always ask you before we end these sessions is that, you're quite up on finances, the way the markets work. As a matter of fact, that's your profession, and Vere Global is an investment advisement firm. And I followed you over several years now, and you've been right on target about the way the market moves and what who's going to benefit, who's going to lose out. And the market trends, and you predict pretty accurately where the highs and the lows are going to be, considering all the essentially destructive influences that we've just covered. People who have stock, what should they do? Should they go to cash? Should they head for the hills? Should they leave this country? Should they buy a private island? Or should they stay in the stock market? Well, is a big crash coming, as many are predicting? What do you do if you have stock?
I would say hold on to stocks. I would say even buy more stocks. You're correct. There is going to be a big crash coming, but it's still several years away. If you look at all the stock market crashes in history, every crash has always been preceded by the Federal Reserve raising interest rates. Every single one. Now, right now, the Federal Reserve is not raising interest rates, but we did have a Federal Reserve meeting today, which did cause the Dow to lose several hundred points, and the S&P sold off because the Fed was called the dot plot. The dot plot is basically where each Federal Reserve voting member gets to make an estimate of where they think interest rates are going to be at over the next 2 years. And what kind of caught the markets by surprise that sent the market selling off today was every Federal Reserve governor thinks at a minimum there's going to be at least 2 rate hikes next year, and an additional 4 rate hikes the year after that. Wow. With the highest estimate, one Federal Reserve governor is actually on his dot plot was predicting that interest rates will go up 7 times next year, and that's what kind of put the markets in a frenzy. I don't think they'll raise rates next year, but at some point they will, and after they start raising rates, that's when you have to start worrying about a stock market crash.
But again, you're saying that's at least several years away.
Still several years. The Fed still has plenty of money that it can pump into the economy, and that will keep on pushing stocks higher and higher. But unfortunately, just like during the 1920s, when the Federal Reserve was pumping all this money into the economy and it was finding its way in the stock market, as you kind of see today, you had one group of people that became extremely, extremely wealthy, and another group of people, the middle class, became very, very poor. And at some point, reality and fantasy got together in 1929, and you had a huge problem. And that's what's going to happen eventually. This fantasy world of these sky-high valuations and printing unlimited amounts of money eventually at some point has to come to an end. And when it does, it's going to be a sad day for stock owners. But between now and then, be aggressive on your stocks. Don't worry about a 10 or 15% sell off in the stock market. Use that as a buying opportunity. Don't become concerned until the Fed starts raising interest rates. And more importantly, once the Fed starts raising interest rates, watch what's called the yield curve for when it inverts. Because historically, once the yield curve inverts, you have about, on average, between 9 and 12 months before everything goes to hell in a handbasket.
Explain the yield curve for those that are not conversant with that.
The yield curve is when short-term interest rates go above long-term interest rates. So to kind of give you an idea of how the banking system works, the banks, when interest rates are low, banks will go and borrow money at low interest rates. They will then loan it out at high interest rates to consumers. So, right now in a bank, for your deposits, you pay 0%, but you go get a mortgage or a car loan, you might pay 4 or 5%. The banks borrow at the short-term rate and then loan it out at the high-end rate. When the short-term rates go above the long-term rates, banks don't want to borrow money anymore. So they stop lending money out, because they lend any money out after the yield curve inverts, that's actually going to be a loss to them on the books. So at that point, banks basically drop and they won't give out any loans, and that basically causes money to leave the economy. And when money leaves the economy, that's when you get recessions.
All right, so that's one of the earmarks to watch for when that happens.
Correct.
Okay, so wrapping it up now, Mark, the guy behind me, the President of the United States, there he is getting off the plane for the G7 conference in Geneva, and then the talk with Putin. So he came there with what his supporters were saying were high hopes. He was going to set things straight with Putin and get together again with the G7 nations, warm them up again with the United States. Everything was going to be good. So you're saying that he left without much.
Correct. He didn't leave with a lot. He basically he basically took a European vacation. He sat there and got invited to the club, and the people in the club said it's so nice to talk to somebody that doesn't, tell you how things should operate. But I think if you're doing things in the best interest of the country, you need to be telling your foreign allies this is the way it's going to be. So yes, in long story short, I don't think anything important. It was more of just a marketing scheme to say, hey, everything's good, blah, blah, blah. But in reality, nothing's going to happen, because, again, you need the Senate and the House of Representatives. Anything Biden agreed on in those meetings, the Senate and the House of Representatives have to vote on that and agree with them, because they represent the people, and the United States is supposed to be for the people.
And the Democrats won't be successful in ending the filibuster.
They will not. And if they do, don't forget, several years ago, they changed some of the laws. And then once they lost power, the Republicans hit those exact same changes hot and heavy on them. I think the actual law change was on appointing federal judges to the bench. They changed the laws on that to where it only required a 51-person vote to put federal judges on the bench. And then, of course, when the Republicans took power, Donald Trump basically appointed more federal judges using that rule change the Democrats put in place of 51. He put more Federal Reserve, more conservative federal judges on the bench in his 4 years than any president over an 8-year term had ever put into office.
Right.
So if they remove the filibuster at some point, the Republicans will take over power and they will have a 51% weapon in their hands that they can do the exact same thing and pass laws like that. And it's just a never ending circle. Republicans are mad at Democrats now because they're in power. As soon as the Republicans get in power, they'll take a pound of flesh to get even with the Democrats, and the Democrats will sit there and just salivate waiting for when they get back in office so they can take 3 pounds of flesh from the Republicans. And it's a never-ending cycle.
And so it goes. Mark Collinsworth of Vere Global, thanks once again for your insights and having some fun. Although it's not funny what we've talked about, but this has exposed what's really going on, and you have to laugh because if you don't laugh, you'd be crying.
That's true.
Mark Collinsworth of Vere Global, thanks again for being with us.
Thank you, Larry. Enjoyed it.